I've been watching this channel for a few days now, and I've seen many stories here that have really moved me. So I decided to write mine and send it in. I don't know if anyone has ever experienced something similar, but to this day, this event haunts me and makes me question whether we're truly alone in this world. This happened a few years ago when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the dense forests of Maine. I've always loved outdoor adventures, and after months of stressful work, I thought a secluded retreat would be perfect to relax and recharge. The cabin belonged to an old acquaintance of my family and was about 30 miles from the nearest town, a perfect place to disconnect from the world. I arrived at dusk, and everything seemed peaceful. The place was small but cozy, with a single room serving as both the kitchen and living area, a tiny bathroom, and a bedroom with a wooden bed. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched for miles, seemingly endless. The only thing that concerned me was the fact that there was no cell signal, but at that moment, I thought it would only make the experience more immersive. I spent the first few hours exploring the surroundings and chopping wood for the fireplace. The silence of the forest was almost absolute, interrupted only by the wind rustling through the trees. When night fell, I lit the fireplace and prepared a simple dinner, listening to the crackling of the burning wood. That's when I noticed something strange. In the middle of my meal, I heard a noise coming from the forest, something like the snapping of breaking branches. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the darkness between the trees. I assumed it was just a deer or another wild animal passing by and went back to eating. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, the footsteps sounded closer. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door. When I shined the light into the forest, the beam revealed only trees and more trees, no movement in sight. Even so, a chill ran down my spine. I went back inside and locked the door. I no longer felt as comfortable as I had before. The night went on, and the wind outside began to howl even louder. I lay in bed, trying to ignore my paranoia. But around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by another sound, the sound of scratching against the outer wall of the cabin. Terror gripped me. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. The scratching continued for a few seconds and then stopped. But then, a new sound echoed through the room. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. Someone was trying to get in. My body froze the moment I heard the knocks on the door. 3 slow, calculated taps. They weren't the impatient knocks of a lost traveler asking for help. They were cold, methodical, as if whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. I held my breath and remained still in bed. The only light in the cabin came from the dying embers in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I tried to rationalize. It could just be a hunter, someone who had happened to see the cabin and wanted to take shelter from the cold. But what about the scratches on the wall and the footsteps I had heard before? My instincts screamed at me not to move. But then came the 4th knock, louder, more impatient. By now, my mind was in full panic mode. I knew I couldn't call the police since there was no cell service. The shotgun that used to be in the cabin, I remembered seeing it when I came here with my family years ago, wasn't in its usual place. The owner had probably taken it with him. All I had was a pocket knife in my backpack. Silence. Whoever was out there seemed to be waiting for a response. Slowly, I got up from the bed and tiptoed to the kitchen, trying not to make a sound. I grabbed the carving knife from the sink and held it tight, even though I knew that if it was someone dangerous, I wouldn't stand much of a chance. The wood on the porch creaked. My blood ran cold. The person, or thing, was moving around the cabin. Each step was careful, as if they were studying the place, looking for a weak spot. That's when I realized I had forgotten to lock the window next to the bed. My eyes widened. I turned to run and close it, but just as I took my first step, I heard a dull thud, the window sliding up a few inches. Adrenaline surged through my body. I sprinted toward the bedroom, but when I got there, the window was already open. The cold wind blew inside, rustling the curtain. And then I saw it. A hand, dirty, pale, with long skeletal fingers, gripping the window frame. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed the chair in the corner of the room and threw it against the window with all my strength. The crash echoed through the cabin, and I heard a muffled scream from outside. Something moved quickly through the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I ran to lock the window, then grabbed my backpack and keys. I needed to get out of there. I rushed out the front door without looking back, sprinted to my car, and jumped inside, locking the doors. I started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the dirt road. Before speeding off, I took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw the shadow. At the edge of the forest, between the trees, a tall, thin figure was watching me. The glow of my headlights reflected in its eyes that didn't look human. I hit the gas without a second thought. I drove non-stop until I reached the main road, my chest still rising and falling uncontrollably. I never went back to that cabin. The owner of the property said no one lived nearby and that I must have imagined things. But even now, sometimes, late at night, I find myself remembering those knocks on the door and that pale hand at the window. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't acted so quickly. I never used to believe in ghosts. I always thought horror stories were exaggerated, born from imagination or collective fear. But after what happened that night inside the abandoned hospital in Vermont, my perception of what is real and what isn't changed forever. It was a Friday night when my friend Daniel suggested we explore the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for decades, with dark stories about patients who suffered abuse and macabre experiments. Of course, most of these stories seemed like urban legends, but still, people avoided going near the building. I didn't want to go. Something told me it was a terrible idea, but Daniel insisted. He said it was just an old building and that it would be fun. In the end, I was convinced by two more friends, Jake and Oliver, and soon we were driving down the winding road leading to the hospital. The place was massive, an imposing structure with broken windows and rusted doors. The moonlight barely illuminated the dark corridors, and a cold wind whistled through the crumbling walls. As we stepped inside, the air smelled of mold and rust. The silence was almost absolute, except for the sound of our own footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. We walked with flashlights in hand, exploring different floors. We found old patient files, rusted gurneys, and even a restraint chair left in the corner of a room. The hospital was in ruins, but it still carried a heavy atmosphere, as if something had never truly left. That's when Oliver suggested we split up to cover more ground. Daniel and Jake went upstairs while Oliver and I stayed on the ground floor. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. As we walked down a narrow corridor, we noticed something strange. One of the doors, unlike the others that were open or falling apart, was completely shut. Oliver tried turning the handle, but it was locked. "How is this door still locked after all this time?" he asked. Before we could think about it further, we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. We looked at each other, confused. "Jake? Daniel?" I called out, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, heavy and slow. The sound of something being dragged echoed through the halls. Then we heard a scream from above. It was Daniel. Oliver and I ran up the stairs, our flashlights shaking in our hands. We found Jake in the corridor, pale, pointing toward one of the rooms. He's in there," Jake stammered. We entered the room and found Daniel leaning against the wall, gasping for breath. He pointed toward the corridor and said, his voice trembling, "There was someone there. I saw a woman." Oliver chuckled, trying to keep calm. "Come on, man, you must have imagined it." But Daniel insisted. "She was at the end of the hallway, wearing a white coat, but her face, it wasn't normal." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, as if the building itself was reacting to our conversation, we heard a loud creak coming from the corridor. Slowly we stepped out, our flashlights trembling as we pointed them toward the darkness ahead. And then we saw it. At the end of the corridor, a silhouette was moving slowly. The white coat, dirty and torn, was visible even in the dim light. But the worst part was when the flashlight beam illuminated its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Its face was just a void. No eyes, no mouth. Just a dark blur that seemed to shift and pulsate. as if the darkness itself was alive. The entity began moving toward us. We ran. Without looking back, we rushed down the stairs, sprinting toward the exit. The building seemed even darker and more claustrophobic. We could hear the footsteps behind us getting closer, accompanied by a horrible sound, a sharp hiss like someone trying to whisper our names. When we finally reached the exit, the door that had been wide open before was now nearly shut. I lunged and forced it open, feeling an icy shiver crawl up my spine. And then, in the last second before stepping outside, I felt something touch my shoulder. A hand. Cold, bony, but I didn't look back. We ran to the car, started the engine, and sped away as fast as we could. No one spoke until we got back to town. The only thing Daniel said before we all went to our homes that night was, "She saw us." I didn't sleep that night, and the worst part? The next day, we checked the photos we had taken in the hospital, and in one of them, at the end of the corridor, it was clearly visible, the silhouette, watching us. The next day, no one wanted to talk about what had happened. We tried to go about our routines as if it had all been a trick of our imagination, but the problem was that we had all seen the same thing, and we had proof. That morning, Jake sent a message in our group chat. "Look at the last photo we took at the hospital." I hesitated before opening it, already feeling a chill run down my spine. When I finally did, my stomach turned. At the end of the corridor, right where Daniel had said he saw the woman, there was a silhouette. It wasn't a blur or a trick of the light. It was a distinct figure wearing a torn white coat, and where a face should have been, there was only a dark void. No one replied for a few minutes until Oliver finally typed, "I want to forget this. Don't send anything else." I wanted to forget too, but it wouldn't leave me alone. I spent the entire night thinking about that cold hand I had felt on my shoulder before leaving the hospital. I could swear that wasn't just my imagination. In the days that followed, all of us seemed disturbed. Daniel was quieter than usual. Oliver started having nightmares, and Jake said he constantly felt like he was being watched. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but then the strange coincidences started. One night, I was home alone when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. My heart pounded. I got up to check, but there was nothing there. However, when I returned to my room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My flashlight, the same one I had used that night, was on, sitting on my desk. I was absolutely certain that I hadn't turned it on. I immediately called Daniel, and he picked up right away. Before I could even say anything, he asked, "Dude, did something weird just happen to you?" My heartbeat skyrocketed. "Why?" I asked. He took a deep breath before replying, "Because my door just opened by itself." That was enough to convince us that something was still haunting us. We decided we had to go back to the hospital, not to go inside, but to try and understand what we had disturbed. The next day, Daniel, Jake, and I drove back to the site. Oliver refused to come. When we arrived, we stood outside the hospital for a long time, just staring at the decaying structure. The place looked even more ominous than before. "If something followed us, maybe we can return it," Jake said hesitantly. We had no idea what we were doing, but we stood at the entrance and threw the flashlight back inside the building. Then, each of us muttered something along the lines of, "We don't want you here anymore." Maybe it was just a silly ritual we made up on the spot. Maybe it was just for our own peace of mind. But after that, things went back to normal. The nightmares faded, the feeling of being watched disappeared, and we never experienced anything supernatural again. We never spoke about it again, and we never went back to the hospital. But even now, whenever I pass by that road, I feel a chill creep up my spine. And sometimes when I glance at the hospital's window, I swear I see a silhouette standing there, watching us. Lake Superior always felt strange to me. Ever since I was a kid, I heard stories about boats that vanished without a trace, fishermen who never returned, and shadows moving beneath the icy waters. But like anyone else, I thought they were just legends meant to scare tourists and younger residents. Until one day, I learned the hard way that some stories are real. It happened last summer. My name is Ryan. I'm 27, and I've always loved kayaking. I grew up paddling on Lake Superior with my father, and despite hearing the stories, I was never afraid of those waters. The lake is massive, larger than some seas, and the water, even in summer, is cold enough to freeze your bones. But I loved the solitude it provided. That afternoon, I was alone in my kayak exploring a more remote area of the lake. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Everything was silent except for the gentle sound of the small waves lapping against my kayak's hull. That's when I noticed something strange. The lake's surface was calm, but off in the distance I saw a small disturbance in the water, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. I stopped paddling and watched. It could have been a large fish, maybe a sturgeon or a pike. But then, the disturbance started moving, in a straight line, heading directly toward me. The first thought that crossed my mind was that it might be a floating log drifting with the current. But there wasn't a strong current there. And more importantly, it wasn't floating. It was moving fast, like it was swimming. My heartbeat picked up. I gripped my paddle and slowly started making my way back to the shore. I didn't want to seem scared, but something deep inside me screamed to get out of there as quickly as possible. And then I saw it. It emerged. Not much. Just enough to make my breath catch in my throat. A hand, a pale hand with long, thin fingers breaking the surface of the water for a brief moment before vanishing back into the depths. I let out a shout and started paddling frantically. My kayak rocked from side to side as I fought against the rising panic. I could feel the water moving behind me, something closing in fast. I didn't look back. All that mattered was reaching the shore. My hands trembled as I paddled as hard as I could. I could swear I felt something brushing against the hull of my kayak, a faint scratching against the fiberglass. And then, out of nowhere, everything went silent. The lake was calm again. My breathing was ragged, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I looked around, searching for any sign of that thing, but the water was smooth as glass. Only when I finally reached the shore and leapt from my kayak did I turn back, and that's when I saw it. In the middle of the lake, right where I had been just moments before, a silhouette stood. It was humanoid, but something was off. Its body seemed too thin, almost translucent against the reflection of the setting sun. I couldn't see its face, but I knew. It was looking at me. I stood frozen, watching, until the thing slowly sank, disappearing into the darkness of the lake. Since then, I've never gone back to Lake Superior. But sometimes, when I pass by the shore and glance at the water, I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, waiting. Since that night on Lake Superior, my life has never been the same. I tried to forget what I saw, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, an illusion caused by the setting sun's light and an irrational fear of deep waters. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the scratch on my kayak's hull. The next day, I went to the garage where I kept it and knelt down to inspect it. My hands trembled when I saw what was there. It wasn't just any scratch. It was long, thin marks, as if fingernails had scraped along the surface. They were deep, like something had tried to pull me under. After that, I decided to tell someone. My father had always been a skeptic, but he knew everything about the lake. When I told him my story, he just stared at me in silence, his eyes dark and distant. "You saw it then," he finally said. "What did I see?" I asked, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. He sighed, took a cigarette, and gazed out the kitchen window toward the lake. "My grandfather used to talk about something like this when I was a kid," he said. "He claimed there was something in Lake Superior, something old. He called it the one who waits." Those words sent shivers through me. My father continued, "Back then, a lot of fishermen went missing. People thought they were just accidents, but there were strange reports. Marks on boats, bodies that were never found. My grandfather swore that on certain nights he saw something rise from the water and watch the boats. something that wasn't human. I swallowed hard. And you? Do you believe that? He took a long drag of his cigarette and looked at me. I don't know, he admitted. But I think you shouldn't go back there. I wish I could say I followed his advice, that I was smart and never went near Lake Superior again. But something inside me couldn't let it go. Weeks passed, and every night I dreamed of the thing in the lake. I dreamed of the pale hand rising from the water, the silhouette on the surface, the invisible eyes watching me. And then I made the mistake of going back. This time I drove, parking near the shore with no intention of getting in the water. I just wanted to look, to find some rational explanation for what I had seen. The lake was calm, reflecting the stars like a black mirror, and then I saw it. There, in the middle of the lake, a head slowly emerged. My heart nearly stopped. The thing didn't move, just floated there like a forgotten corpse. But I knew it was alive. I knew it was watching me. I was frozen, unable to breathe. Then it started to move, toward me. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. The water around it began to ripple as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. And that's when I saw it. More hands surfaced around it, as if they were pulling the creature up. Many hands. Too many to be human. That snapped me out of my trance. I ran back to my car, shaking, and sped away without looking back. I never returned to Lake Superior. I never spoke of that night again. But sometimes when I drive near the shore, I swear I see something in the water, watching me, waiting. I was never the type to believe in urban legends. I always thought those stories were made up to scare kids or keep teenagers away from certain places. But that night, on a deserted road in New Hampshire, I learned the hard way that some legends might be real. It was late October, and I was driving home after meeting some friends in a nearby town. The night was cold, and a dense fog was spreading across the road, covering everything in a thick, opaque mist. Mine was the only car on the highway, and the only things illuminating the path were my headlights and the full moon peeking through the dry trees. And then I saw her. Standing on the shoulder of the road ahead was a woman. She wore a long white dress that swayed slightly with the cold wind. Her dark hair fell loosely over her shoulders. She didn't look lost, but she didn't seem to be waiting for anyone either. The road was surrounded by dense forest on both sides, with no houses or businesses nearby. Who would be standing there alone in the darkness? My first instinct was to ignore her and keep driving. But as I got closer, something inside me made me slow down. She didn't raise her hand to ask for a ride. She just stood there, staring at the road. I pulled over beside her and rolled down my window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman slowly turned her head to look at me. Her face was pale, almost devoid of color. Her eyes were sunken and dark, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Can you take me?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Sure, get in." She opened the door and sat in the passenger seat. The moment she closed the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The car, which had been warm just seconds ago, suddenly felt freezing. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She stared straight ahead, not looking at me. "Just keep driving." I swallowed hard and kept my eyes on the road. The silence in the car was suffocating. I tried to observe her from the corner of my eye, but something about her filled me with deep unease. The dress looked old-fashioned, something out of another era, and her feet, they were bare, covered in dirt and leaves. "Do you live around here?" I asked. She turned her face toward me slowly, and for the first time, a real shiver ran through me. Her eyes had no light in them, as if there was no life behind them. "It doesn't matter," she replied. My heart started beating faster. Something was wrong. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand who she was, but something inside me screamed not to press further. I kept driving, each minute stretching into an eternity. The road felt longer than before, as if it would never end. Then, Out of nowhere, she whispered, "We're almost there." "Almost where?" She pointed ahead. A sharp curve was coming up in the road. In the distance, an old guardrail was twisted and mangled, as if something had crashed there long ago. But what made me slam on the brakes was what I saw just beyond the curve. A wrecked car, rusted and covered in dead leaves, lay abandoned between the trees. My hands trembled as I realized something that made my blood run cold. The car was identical to mine. I turned to look at the woman beside me, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. A sickly scent of wilted flowers and damp earth filled the car. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. And then, before I could react, a breathy whisper brushed against my ear. "You should have kept driving." And at that moment, I knew. The legend of the woman in white wasn't just a story. My fingers were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. The car sat motionless in the middle of the road, headlights casting eerie beams onto the wreckage buried between the trees. Yet, despite being alone, I could still feel a presence inside the car, a lingering, invisible gaze watching me. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe that wrecked car only resembled mine, but wasn't actually the same. But deep down, I knew the truth. My breathing was heavy and uneven. I needed to leave. I turned the ignition again and reached for the gear shift. But the instant I touched it, the dashboard lights flickered. The radio, which had been off the entire drive, suddenly turned on. Static filled the cabin, followed by a weak, distorted voice. "You shouldn't have stopped." My heart nearly exploded in my chest. My hands trembled as I fumbled to turn off the radio, but the buttons wouldn't respond. The voice continued, breaking through the crackling interference. "You saw it." A chill crept down my spine. I checked the rearview mirror, expecting, dreading, to see something in the back seat. Nothing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, determined to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But as I passed the twisted guardrail, I caught something in my peripheral vision. In the forest, between the trees, she was there. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking. She was just standing between the trunks, watching as my car sped by. Her vacant eyes gleamed unnaturally in the darkness, reflecting the glow of my headlights. I didn't look back. I just drove. The road seemed darker than before, the fog thicker, heavier. My thoughts spun wildly. Who was she? What happened to that wrecked car? I tried to recall the story. I had heard of the White Lady legend before. People said she was the spirit of a young woman who had died on this road years ago, killed in an accident when her car skidded off the curve. Locals believed her spirit wandered the highway, asking unsuspecting drivers for a ride, and those who stopped were never the same. After several miles of silent, desperate driving, I finally saw the glow of a small gas station up ahead. I pulled in and jumped out of the car, relieved to feel solid ground beneath my feet, bathed in warm fluorescent light. The attendant, an old man with a weathered face, eyed me as he wiped his hands on a dirty rag. "You all right, kid?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "You look like you just saw a ghost." I let out a nervous laugh, but said nothing. "You coming from up that way?" he asked, nodding toward the highway. I didn't answer, but my expression must have given everything away. His face darkened. He exhaled slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "You saw her, didn't you?" My throat went dry. The woman on the road?" The old man sighed and nodded. "You ain't the first. Some drivers pass right by, but the ones who stop, well, they say she gets in the car." I swallowed hard. "What happens to them?" I asked. The attendant looked down as if carefully choosing his words. "Some don't come back, but the ones who do..." He hesitated. "They say something changes." I shivered. "Changes? How?" He was silent for a moment. Then slowly, he pointed at the glass storefront next to us. I turned my head toward the reflection. There I was, My own reflection, just as I expected. But behind me, just over my shoulder, a white figure hovered. I spun around instantly, but there was nothing there, only the silence of the night. I left the gas station without another word. Since that night, I've never taken that road again. I've never spoken about what I saw. But sometimes, on foggy nights when I'm driving alone, I feel a sudden, chilling cold fill my car. And for just a moment, I get the terrifying sense that I'm not alone. It's been a few days since I've been trying to write this account, but every time I start, a shiver runs down my spine. Maybe it's the fear of reliving everything that happened, or maybe it's that strange feeling that by telling it, I might somehow bring it back into my life. My name is Ryan, and this happened to me last summer. I've always been fascinated by national parks, and Yellowstone was at the top of my list of places to explore. As an amateur photographer, my goal was to capture the wild beauty of the region, especially the less touristy areas. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon when the sky was tinged orange by the sunset. I chose a remote campsite near a little-used trail. The idea was to spend 3 days there, far from the chaos of the city and connected to nature. The first day was peaceful. I hiked a few trails, took incredible photos of the geysers and rock formations. At night, I set up a small campfire and admired the starry sky. Everything was perfect, until I noticed something strange. On the other side of the clearing near the trees, I saw a figure standing still. At first I thought it was just another camper, maybe a hunter. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the silhouette wasn't moving. It was just standing there, motionless, watching me. The discomfort started to build inside me. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound confident. No response, just the wind passing through the trees and the distant howl of a coyote. I decided to ignore it and went into my tent, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if someone was out there, waiting. The next day, I got up early and decided to explore a more remote area of the park. I walked for hours, capturing amazing images of the untouched landscape. But the feeling of being watched never left me. And then, around noon, something happened that chilled my blood. While reviewing the photos on my camera, I noticed something strange in one of the images. In the corner of one of the photos I took that morning, there was a dark silhouette among the trees, the same stranger from the night before. My breathing grew heavy. He had been there the whole time, even when I thought I was alone. I looked around, feeling my heart race. The trees seemed closer together, the forest denser. Suddenly, I no longer felt safe. I decided to return to the campsite immediately. As I hurried along the trail, I heard small cracks among the trees, footsteps. But every time I stopped and looked back, I saw nothing. The way back seemed to take twice as long. When I finally arrived at the campsite, my tent was different. The zipper was open. My belongings were scattered. Someone had been there. Fear took hold of me. I grabbed my camera and started photographing the surroundings, hoping to capture anything strange. And that's when, upon checking the photos, I found the most terrifying image of all. A photo of my tent, taken from the middle of the trees. Someone had photographed me. Someone had been there the night before while I slept. The only thing I knew was that I had to get out of there before nightfall. But the worst was yet to come. My heart pounded. I held the camera with trembling hands as my eyes scanned the most terrifying image I had ever seen. Someone had photographed me. Someone had been there, hidden in the forest, watching. My first instinct was to grab my things and leave immediately. But something inside me told me I was no longer alone. The forest was too silent, as if all the animals had vanished. I needed to be quick. I threw the camera into my backpack and started dismantling my tent in a hurry, folding everything carelessly. But then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved between the trees. The same figure. Tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't see its face, only the dark silhouette contrasting against the fading afternoon light. And then it took a step forward. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. That's when the figure raised an arm and pointed at me. I didn't want to know what that meant. I grabbed my backpack, abandoned the tent, and ran. The forest blurred around me as my feet moved on their own. I didn't even look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. I just wanted to get out of there. The way back to the road felt endless. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows among the trees stretched longer, making everything even more sinister. With every snapping branch, my heart jumped in my chest. Then, in the middle of the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. Someone had walked that path before me, and worse. They led back to my campsite, which meant whoever it was already knew I would flee that way. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by fast footsteps, like someone was running straight at me. I didn't think. I just ran faster. Adrenaline flooded my body, and I kept sprinting until I finally saw the road ahead. My car. I had never been so happy to see it. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. When I finally pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The trail was empty. Just the dark forest. But I knew. Someone was there, watching. I floored the gas pedal and got out of that place as fast as possible. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to a hotel. I locked the door to my room and checked the photos on my camera again. Now that I was safe, I tried to analyze the image of my tent, and that's when I saw something even worse. The photo didn't just show my tent. There was something else. In the background, among the trees, two eyes glowed in the darkness, and they were staring right at me. The next day, I reported everything to a park ranger. I showed him the photos, told him about the figure in the forest and how my tent had been ransacked. The man listened carefully, but in the end, he just shook his head. "Yellowstone is full of mysteries," he said. "But if I were you, I wouldn't go back to that campsite." He then told me that other campers had reported feeling watched in that area. Some claimed to have seen someone in the forest. Others heard whispers at night. But no one had ever figured out who or what it was, or if it was even human. I never went back to Yellowstone, and to this day, every time I see a photo of myself, I wonder, how many other times have I been photographed without realizing it?